I'm very fortunate to be joined on this special midweek supplemental episode of Let's Get Fiscal by prominent modern monetary theorist and economist Phil Lawn. He's teaching at the University of Adelaide at the moment and is also a research fellow with the Centre of Full Employment and Equity out of Newcastle, directed by the inimitable Bill Mitchell. And I'm going to be talking with Phil today about overcoming common objections to modern monetary theory and a job guarantee. So I hope you enjoy it. Okay, Phil, thanks for joining us.
No problem, Ian.
So the goal here is just to come up with some common responses to overcome objections that we hear when talking about MMT and a job guarantee. And the first big one is it's pretty easy to get people to accept that the government creates money. You know, like Donald Trump said it, and now everyone agrees. But what the problem we have now is that everyone says, "Oh, but it's inflationary to print money." You know, we've got this printing money thing. So when people say that to you, what do you say about inflation? What do you say to replace that term printing money? Because it's not very accurate.
It's not accurate. I mean, they don't print money. In fact, most money exists electronically, so they're just crediting bank accounts when the government spends. But the thing about this notion of printing money is that, in fact, basically, we're talking about a central government here, a currency issuing central government. We're not talking about state governments or local governments, because they're just like you and I. They're a user of a currency. We're talking about a currency issuing central government that is the monopoly owner and issuer of the currency. And in fact, even though the way in which the federal government and some of the arrangements are organised, it appears as though taxes are funding government spending. In reality, every dollar of federal government spending, so we're talking about Australia, is essentially a new dollar created out of nothing and spent into existence. So it's not as if some spending is financed by so-called printing money electronically, but we can put it in inverted commas, printing money, and some by taxes. All of it is basically printing money.
Okay.
Every dollar of federal government spending is financed at the point of expenditure.
Okay.
Taxes don't fund the spending. The taxes just destroy enough private sector spending power to leave enough real resources available so the government can get their hands on it without having to compete with the private sector. So when the federal government spends, it's not hyperinflationary.
Okay, so at the moment we have this system where if the government wants to spend more than it has taxed, it has to issue bonds in the amount that it wants to spend.
No, it doesn't have to do that.
The AOFM issue, well, it's got like a standing order. So whenever the government deficit spends, there's bonds issued to the same amount to balance it out.
Well, no, it's not about it doesn't have to do it. And the only real reason why it does it is to allow the Reserve Bank to set and defend its target cash rate. You know,
right.
That cash rate they set when they meet every month?
Yeah.
So they have to do that because, believe it or not, if the federal government's running a deficit, it would be placing downward pressure on that cash rate.
Right, okay. And so, yeah, but it is set up at the moment so that happens. It makes it look as if. I know that the government doesn't have to do it, but it does make it look as if that's what's happening, right? Can
I just briefly explain why they have to do it, in a sense?
Yeah.
They don't have to do it, but they do it because when the government spends, the federal government spends, it creates money and injects it into the economy through its own spending. Mm-hmm. When it taxes the private sector, it's destroying private sector spending power. Okay, so when the federal government's spending more than it's taxing, there's a net injection of spending power into the economy. Okay, and that comes to people like you and I, and whether we spend it or what have you, it basically ends up deposited in bank accounts, and that particular money manifests itself as excess reserves in what are referred to as exchange settlement accounts. Mm-hmm. All the major banks have got these exchange settlement accounts where they conduct transactions amongst themselves and with the Reserve Bank. So when the government is running a deficit, there's a surplus funds in these particular exchange settlement accounts. and the Reserve Bank pays an interest on those reserves if they're left overnight in those accounts, which is always 0.25% less than its target cash rate.
Okay.
And that might not sound like much, but we're talking about a lot of money, and we're talking about profit-seeking banks. Okay, so just imagine at present the target cash rate is 1.5%. Then that means that these money left in these reserve account exchange settlement accounts are basically earning 0.25% less than that, which is 1.25%. Mm-hmm. So a bank could leave it in those accounts overnight, because we're talking about the short-term money market, for 1.25%, or it could lend it out at a higher rate. Well, it's not going to lend it out at 1.6%, because no one's going to borrow at 1.6% when the target cash rate is 1.5%. But a bank might, for example, lend it out at 1.49%.
Okay, and that's lending to other banks. It's not lending to the private sector, right?
No, that's right. But another bank will want to, perhaps, in order to get rid of...
I just want to make the point that you're not talking about lending it out to mortgages.
No, it's not that. This is something. This is trying to lend it out.
Interbank lending.
Yeah, interbank lending. And, of course, another bank will try to outcompete that particular bank, and they'll lend it out in interbank loan at, say, 1.48%. And of course, you can see what's happening. The cash rate is being driven down, and it will continue to go down unless the Reserve Bank intervenes until it reaches 1.25%.
Right.
So, of course, the Reserve Bank can't allow it to do that because it has a target of 1.5%. So how does it keep the cash rate at the target rate? Well, what it does is it has to drain those reserves, and it does that by selling bonds. So the bonds do not fund the budget shortfall. They enable the Reserve Bank to set and defend a target cash rate,
right?
When the government's running a deficit, because otherwise the cash rate would fall to the default rate that's paid on the
reserves.
On the reserves.
So I've watched Randall Wray talk about this, and he says basically that the only reason that the Treasury issues bonds in the same amount that a deficit spends is to give the central bank the leverage it needs to soak up the reserves. Otherwise, if it kept happening, it wouldn't be able to hit its target rate.
Yeah.
Now,
and of course that looks as though, given it's the same amount, as if they're selling these bonds in order to finance the budget shortfall.
Right.
That's
and it's called borrowing. I mean, that's the big problem.
Yeah, it's not borrowing at all. These funds, would be earning 1.25%. Okay.
Right.
If the Reserve Bank drains those reserves by selling bonds, then all they end up doing is just shifting those reserves into what you might call bond accounts, but really there shouldn't be a term government bonds. You can have private sector bonds. Reserve Bank bonds are nothing more than Reserve Bank term deposits.
Right, okay.
That's all.
I like that terminology.
It's all it is. It's just and that money does not go to the federal government in order for it to spend. It just gets shifted from one account, reserve account, into basically a term deposit account. That's all it is.
So I called it because I watched the presentation you and Steve did for the Greens, yes. And you've got that slide in there, the Gerald Dodgson presentation slide that says that bonds are not to fund expenditure.
Yeah, that's right.
So I tried to call up the Australian Office of Financial Management and speak to Gerald Dodgson. He's retired, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
And I spoke to this other guy named Brad, and I said to Brad, there's this slide, and it says this, and he said, that slide's out of date. That comes from a time when the government was running a surplus, so they didn't need to borrow in order to spend. They needed to sell these bonds in order to keep up, the demand for bonds in the private bond market or whatever. And this was this submission that Mosler and Mitchell made in 2002 for some inquiry about it. I can't remember the name of the paper, but this was the whole thing where they were running a surplus and they still needed to sell these bonds. It's like, okay, obviously they don't need it to fund expenditure. Yeah. But this guy at the AOFM was like, oh no, now that they're deficit spending, they definitely have to do it in order to fund it. And I was like, oh wow, it's so hard to get this message across if people who work at these places have the wrong idea. So I made this video that was like that demonstrated basically, even if you take that guy's version of it, and the government does issue the bonds and then gets the money and then spends the money, right? Even if that's what happened, you still end up with a net financial asset creation because you created bonds. Like whether they're issuing bonds out of thin air or money out of thin air, what's the difference?
That's right.
So when it comes to inflation specifically,
actually, can I just make a point about this idea that if the government runs a deficit, it has to issue bonds?
Right.
And I pointed out that they only issue bonds in order to set and defend a target cash rate. Well, let's look at the situation that occurred with Japan in the 1980s and I think into the 1990s. That 1.25% that's currently being paid on excess reserves, which is 0.25% less than the current target cash rate. Well, in Japan during that period of time, there was nothing paid on excess reserves. The default rate was 0%.
Okay.
The Japanese central bank had no policy to set and defend a target cash rate or whatever they call it, the short-term interest rate. And of course, the Japanese central government was running substantially large deficits, and as a consequence, the banks just competed the short-term interest rate down to 0%. That's how Japan had 0% interest rates despite large budget deficits. But the key thing was, because the central bank wasn't setting and defending a short-term interest rate, they weren't selling any bonds to make up that. So here you had government spending exceeding taxation and no bond sales, indicating that they don't have to sell bonds to pay for the so-called budget shortfall.
Yeah, it's just it's a bit of a mirage. Like we have it set up, it kind of looks that way, but that's not really what's happening.
They only have to do it if they have this institutional arrangement in place where they need to do it in order to set and defend a short-term interest rate. But that's not financing budget shortfall.
So the common thing that we hear from people is that the reason they're doing it. In fact, this is in a linked speech by Peter McRae, given in 2000, who was then the deputy chief of the AOFM. It's linked from a blog article of Bill Mitchell's, saying that this gives us important fiscal discipline. That the need for the government to issue bonds that are subject to a market-driven interest rate, or the yield or whatever it is. I don't really understand how that works. But that this was important fiscal discipline. That private sector, private market discipline was being applied to government spending, which in itself is kind of sick because why would you allow private markets to discipline government spending? But also that's. It seems like it's an arbitrary constraint. Like we've just said, oh, well, we have to balance it this way. But in fact, we could just allow the government to spend some other amount without issuing bonds, and it wouldn't be inflationary as long as we had some other check and balance in place.
Well, it's not. The issuing of the bond, I guess I'm going back to the point I just made, is it's got nothing to do with fiscal discipline because... but
the AOFM, they're on record as saying that it is. How can you argue? I don't know how you can argue with it.
What way is it?
How can I argue with it? How can I come across an economist who says this and points to a on the record AOFM? What can we say to these people?
If let's say there's a certain amount of taxation, and the government wants to increase its spending, well, that's just going to increase the difference between government spending and taxation, and I'll just issue more bonds. I mean, it doesn't limit the capacity of the government to spend more money if it wants to.
Right. Okay. So even now, it's not limited.
Yeah, and of course the bonds are redeemed in the national currency, which the central government owns and issues, so it can always pay it back.
Yeah,
it can always pay it back. It's not like everyone's going to be taxed more to pay this back.
So what then would you say? Like when people say, okay, like if the government spends money and it's MMT and no MMT doesn't care about inflation, people always say,
it does care about inflation.
I know it's crazy, but people have this thing in their mind
that
it doesn't.
All that matters really is that we ensure that total spending within the economy, and that's private sector plus public sector spending, is equal to the productive capacity economy, which is basically the full employment level of national income.
Right, and that's it.
That's all that matters. Now, no one who advocates MMT would, once that full employment level is reached, would suggest that the government should further net spend.
Right.
Because you're not going to produce anything because you've reached your productive limit, and it's just going to be inflationary.
Right.
But what they argue is that if the private sector wants to, in the aggregate, we're not talking about individual people, but in the aggregate wants to net save, that is not spend all its income, then the only way total spending can equal the full employment level of income is if the central government runs a budget deficit.
Okay.
And the size of that budget deficit will depend upon the net savings desires of the private sector. The more the private sector wants to net save, the less it spends of its income, the more room that leaves. Because when we're not spending some of our income, we're not claiming some of the real resources and real goods and services being produced, which leaves more for the central government to purchase without it being inflationary.
Right.
Right. So the more the private sector net saves, the larger the deficit has to be in order to achieve full employment. And of course, the central government, currency issuing central government, can run deficits forever. So that's not a problem. The deficit doesn't mean that the central government should go crazy with spending. It just needs to net spend to the level necessary to achieve full employment. Not a dollar more and not a dollar less.
Okay, so the inflation response really just has to be a flat-out denial that there's ever money printing, all government spending is money creation, and that inflation only becomes a problem if we try to spend beyond what the society can produce.
Yes, that's what it is.
And that's the definition. Like, there's no.
No, that's not a theory. That's a fact.
Right,
and
okay.
the other thing is not only must the central government run a deficit if the private sector wishes to net save, to achieve full employment, the government has to run a deficit in order for the private sector to be able to net save.
Right. Yeah.
When the private sector is net saving, it's acquiring more financial assets over a given period, let's say 12 months, then it's taking on new financial liabilities. That requires someone or some entity within the economy to create net financial assets and spend them into existence. There's only one entity that can do that, and that's the federal government. You effectively need someone to counterfeit the currency.
Right.
Because in order to create net financial assets, banks can create money out of thin air, but they always create a financial asset and a financial liability of the same value. If they could create a financial asset that exceeded the financial liability, they would be doing effectively be counterfeiting the currency. That's illegal. You and I can't do it. Only central governments can do it, and we need them to do it because if they don't do it, we cannot net save.
Okay. So that's the inflation response, and the whole thing about I'll tell you one thing that really.
So there's one other point about inflation that's very important too,
Yeah, okay.
and that is if right at the margin you've got something like a job guarantee program where workers are being paid a minimum living wage, which is not the dole, it's something like could be somewhere around $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
Because it's the minimum wage, it serves as like an inflation anchor. So. For example, if an engineer on $150,000 loses his or her job, they get a job guarantee job, and they may be working as an engineer until engineering jobs pick up, and then in the private sector, and they may be earning $40,000. But you will not having a job guarantee program with a minimum living wage. The government won't be competing with the private sector. Right. For engineers.
Yeah.
So, for example, if the job guarantee program paid engineers around $120,000, then it may well be that another engineer on $110,000 in the private sector is going to be perhaps driven away from the private sector in the job guarantee, and the private sector and the government will start competing for those people, and they'll push up wages. You don't have that if you have a minimum living wage. So. The job guarantee ensures that the people that are being employed, firstly, are people the private sector don't want anyway, because the job guarantee is not designed to replace private sector employment or even conventional public sector employment.
Right. Which will still exist. Like there will still be conventional public sector employment as well.
Absolutely.
Like to build bridges and stuff. You can't build a bridge on a job guarantee. Okay, so...
I don't know enough about detail about the job guarantee, but I guess there's the possibility that you could be building a bridge. But
it's like a small one. My understanding is that it has to be quite elastic. If you had a major public works program that was going to take like 10 years to complete, and then it had to have all these wages and then all these workers, and then the private sector picked up and hired out of that pool, you'd have like half a bridge. And which I don't know if that's a bad thing, but it seems to me that major public works are probably things that would just be conventional public sector projects, and then
most of it would be, yes. Most of it would be.
So the other thing that really stumps me is when people talk about expansion of the money supply, right? And then they go on about this M1, M4, the monetary base, and I've never heard MMT economists talk about it, which I presume means that it's pretty meaningless. What's something I can say to people when they bring that up, because it kind of goes over my head. I don't really understand it.
Well, there's various definitions of money, but really at the end of the day, it's not particularly relevant.
Right.
What is the money supply and what isn't? I mean, as long as the government is ensuring that its net spending to the level to ensure that total spending doesn't exceed the full employment level, but exactly equal to full employment level. So you've got full employment. It's no need to keep abreast of the money supply.
Right. So it's a bit of economic sophistry.
You can't define it any of what is money and what isn't.
Yeah,
it's very rubbery,
yeah.
and there's no real need to know. It might be an interesting intellectual problem, puzzle, what have you, but it really is pretty meaningless.
Yeah.
Whether it's greater or less. All that matters is spending, and money supply and spending are two different things.
Right.
So as long as total spending is equal to full employment level of income, and you've got full employment, it really doesn't matter what the money supply happens to be. It's not knowing what it is will not mean that you'll have inflation, because inflation is determined by where total spending is with respect to the full employment level of income. And if the two are the same, and you don't, and the central government's not net spending to a point or to a level that pushes total spending beyond the productive capacity of the economy, you won't have inflation regardless of whether you know what the money supply is.
And this what you said just then kind of made me think of this other thing that I've heard people say about MMT and stuff like that, which is that, like, say we've got the non-government sector has been net saving a lot, and they all want to net save, and that means that there's heaps of money kind of sitting around, or not money but bonds probably, and then eventually people are going to want to spend all that money. Like if China's been exporting to us and they have like $1 trillion, what if they then come in and want to spend all their $1 trillion, and we're paying interest on that $1 trillion, and so then the Chinese have all this money, they're going to buy all the land, and what's the?
No, we're not paying for the. I mean, if
sort of like an externality thing, like how do we compensate for the future inflation that might be possible from all this saved up money being spent?
Well, the government will either have to reduce its own spending, or will have to increase taxation.
Right. So it's just the same. Just like either you just adjust the government spending or taxation.
And that might alter the mix of private sector, public sector mix. But if the government says, look, we're determined to spend up to a certain level, and all of a sudden people are pulling money out of their accounts or bonds that was previously saved, that wasn't being used for spending, to spend, then the government's going to have to tax some of that in order to still be able to spend at a level. If it's determined to produce so many hospitals and schools and bridges and roads and universities, what have you, then it's going to have to perhaps increase the level of taxation in order to access the resources to build these things without it being inflationary. Now, if people don't like that, they can vote that government out of power. That's a political decision. That's not an economic decision.
Yeah, okay, great. Okay, thanks very much for that. That's some good information on inflation. Now, that took about half an hour.
Oh, that's right.
So what's your time like? Do you have some time to keep talking about the job guarantee now? Or?
Yep, that's
Okay,
fine.
okay, great. So there's a few issues that we commonly get from people talking about the job guarantee. The first one I want to bring up is whether or not a job guarantee can or needs to coexist with another welfare payment, another unemployment payment. Now, we know obviously people who are on disability, people who are age pension, you could even reduce the pension age to like 50 or something, whatever. However you want to do it, people could work less hours. But for people who there's some sort of like refusal, they're delinquent. What's the situation now? I mean, is that like a criminal thing, or are we just kind of like giving them a dole, or what?
Well, advocates of the job guarantee are a bit divided on this, but my personal view is that you can't make people work if they don't want to work, and of course you don't want them starving. So you might give them something equivalent to what the dole is today.
Maybe a little bit more, because the dole today is kind of starving.
Well, maybe a little bit more, but it would be nowhere near the job guarantee wage.
Right. So I think maybe one thing that those people in the perception is that they think that the job guarantee wage, because I think like Randall Ray talks about like $10 an hour or something, whatever, which
that's American,
right? Which in Australia is not much money.
No,
but you sort of said before, like a job guaranteed job would be a real wage, and $40,000 a year is not.
I don't know. I'm just plucking a number out.
But it would be something good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not.
Personally, I not only would I have something like $40,000 or perhaps in current money terms as the wage or job guarantee wage, I'd have something similar for the pension. In fact, I'd have that as the tax-free threshold as well.
Yeah, right. That makes sense. It's the tax-free threshold.
Tax-free threshold.
The pension.
So everyone's guaranteed a $40,000.
Right. If they can't work, but if they can work, they go do it.
Yep. And if they don't work, they might get, I don't know, what is the dollar? Is it $20,000 a year?
It's bugger all. I think it might even be like 18. Okay. But
well, let's assume that you can survive on $20,000. Then you might give these people $20,000. But I would argue that in a lot of cases, these people that at first might not want to work, they might see their peers do job guarantee work earning $40,000, actually having a decent income, and I think that they would move into the job guarantee job if they can't get a private sector job. And so I think overall you'd have very few people who would be on the dole. A lot of people are on the dole and choose to be on the dole, not because they're lazy, because they're completely disillusioned. Right. They've been unemployed for 3 or 4 years. You won't have that with a job guarantee. So you won't have these alienated, disillusioned people who are just, they've virtually given up on life, and they'll just do what they can to survive on the dole. And if they want to make extra money, they break into houses or what have you. I'm not saying everyone who does, but
or work in the informal sector. I mean, like you pick up whatever work you can on a construction site, or
I'm not casting aspersions on unemployed people, but
well, I mean, I know even with youth allowance,
it can lead to mental illness, physical illness, desperation, and I'm not saying these are bad people, but that's what unemployment does, and you would do away with most of that with a job guarantee program.
Right. So there's in one sense, it's like we're dealing, in the first instance, we're going to be dealing with the result of decades of involuntary unemployment, which has created problems, personal problems, social problems, health problems, for people, and it will take some time for them to warm up to the idea. Others will just snap into it. They'll just be like, "Thank you."
I think they will.
$40,000, step right up, and then it might take some time bringing people along. What I kind of thought about this, because I went to see Bill and I asked him the same question, and he said, like everyone can do something. And one thing I like that Pavlina Chernova says is that the job guarantee fits the jobs to people, and not the other way around. So really, when everyone's guaranteed a job, you kind of guarantee that you're going to find something for people to do. That and I think that's where Bill's coming from when he says we don't need the dole as well. It's because we're really just going to find something for everyone to do.
But you can't make them do it.
Can't make them do it, but maybe just let them come up with something. If they propose it and it's in line with the community, then teams of unemployed people who didn't want to do a particular thing could maybe come up with something else and then get it approved.
That's it. You're not forced to do, even if you're in a job guarantee. It's not like you'll be doing this. There'll be, I guess, a list of various things that would, it might have to be monitored. You might have to provide evidence that you're producing what you claim you're going to produce. But you could have a university professor who gets the sack and then chooses to continue writing academic papers for $40,000 a year.
Yeah.
And that might be considered as legitimate job guarantee work.
Yeah, so I think that's another hurdle. Is the first major hurdle for people's perceptions of this is that the wage is quite high. It's nothing like work for the dole or the dole. It's not a punishment. It's not a threat. We want people to be able to live and be happy, but maybe not drive a Porsche or even a new car. I mean, I drive like an old Magna from 1995.
And remember, it's not designed for people to stay on.
Right. Yeah.
People can choose to stay on it if they want, but it would be enough to make sure people have the basic necessities and maybe one or two luxuries here and there. That's all.
Something other than eating, paying rent, and clothing themselves.
That's it.
But not exactly sitting on chrome. Okay, no. So that's good. I think that the nature of the work has a lot to do with that perception. The fact that it would be like this coercion, that all it would be was just like cracking rocks or doing some miserable work, and that the wage is punitive. It's not punitive. That's something that's very important. Okay, great. So the next one that I hear a lot, especially from the UBI crowd, is that technological unemployment means that there's nothing left to do.
Well, I think I mentioned this to you a couple of weeks ago. I went to high school in the late 70s, early 80s, and I remember, as a lot of us were likely to move into the workforce, we had the same message. There was all this gloom and doom about automation, bringing about a situation where there was no work for anyone. We shouldn't be frightened of automation because it by rights, it should make human beings more productive.
Right. And maybe we could work less, maybe.
We could work less. We could have a decent income without having to work as maybe just 15, 20 hours.
Right.
A person could choose to work 40 hours and perhaps get a much larger income with the technology that's available. But someone might say, well, I'm happy to have $50,000 a year and work 15, 20 hours a week, which of course means that you don't have to create more hours of work for everyone to have a job. You can start sharing work around.
Yeah. So the job guarantee would actually provide a means for the government to influence that, because I feel as though what's happening now is that with this sort of over-financialization of the economy, we're all working really hard. The wealth is kind of not going into productivity gains that are being shared evenly, and we're not really I think Ray was talking that Adam Smith was just assumed we would be in a leisure economy by now. Even Keynes was like, by the year 2000,
yep,
we'll just be working 4 hours a day and then going to the opera.
Yeah, that's it.
Which has
that was the notion of the post-industrial society, where you're basically the leisure society, the leisure class.
And we kind of have the technology to do that now.
We have the technology to do it.
At least in developed countries we do. But we're kind of not getting there because we've got this weird financial thing going on.
Well, labour markets aren't as flexible as people think they are.
Right.
Generally, most people only have a choice of working full-time, or if they want to work 20 hours a week, then they have to go on some casual employment. There are very few people who would feel that they're comfortable approaching their boss and saying, look, I want all the so-called benefits of full-time employment. I just get paid half as much to do half say 2-3 days work per week. Yeah. So it's not as flexible as people say.
So the technological unemployment thing, I always find it just to be a bit nearsighted. Like
we shouldn't be afraid. We shouldn't be afraid of technology increasing our productivity.
Yeah, and it really
reducing the need to work to have a decent income. That's not an issue. The problem is that there have been productivity gains. They haven't been as large as perhaps they could have been since about in Australia since about the 1970s. But most of the productivity gains, the the so-called income that's being generated is going to capital, not to labour, and
Right.
so therefore people are still having to work very long hours in order to get a decent income.
Yeah, I think that's...
So it's much more about the division of income and the distribution of income and the lack of real flexibility in labour markets, which is making it difficult for people to take on a sea change type of to life that a lot of people would desire, because it's a case of, well, I don't really want to have a 15 to 20 hour a week casual job that's a bit precarious. I really want something that's permanent, but the only permanent work I've got is 40 to 45 hours a week.
Yeah.
And so,
and then some.
and people are probably earning more money than they really want or need.
Well, one thing, a thing I see a lot, amongst my peers, is that there's two people earning incomes in a couple, and one is working to pay the mortgage entirely, which is madness. I mean, if you think about productivity gains going to the 1%, that's it, right?
Yeah. I think this is another issue. When people talk about the cost of living, they usually refer to the inflation rate, and the inflation rate's been quite low for a long period of time. And if you can think about it, when colour televisions were first introduced into Australia, I think they were about $1,000 each. Well, then they're not much more than that now.
Yeah, so right.
But as much as the price of a lot of things hasn't gone up that much, and in some cases has fallen, the cost of living is something completely different again. In order to participate in society, you now have to have, your mobile phone, your computer, your iPad, and technology, which is costly.
Mm.
If you compare a house today to a house 40 years ago, it was much easier to live on a lower income. And a single income. So it's not because we necessarily desire some of these things. We have to have them to participate in society. Mm. So the cost of living cost to live and participate in society, I think, has increased, and that's meant that we have two adults, if they're partners, and with kids, both having to work full time.
Yeah, and
where that wasn't necessary. But my mother was just never really worked, was a housewife, and my dad had a very modest income, and we didn't have luxuries, but we weren't deprived, and we had a colour television set, and we had a car. I think it took a while before we got a new car.
Yeah.
But and I remember getting a second-hand bicycle for my birthday. But the cost of living was much lower.
Well, I think that one thing that I was talking with my wife about this the other day is that we send our children to a school. It's called a Steiner school. It's a bit alternative, and they've got all these wooden toys. They love it. There's these Steiner toys, and they're all handmade in like Sweden or whatever, and they're like $250. You could never afford these things, but that's kind of how much things should be right now. Like if prices had kept pace with the asset prices. Right, so if the price of everything had risen at the same rate that the cost of a house or rent had risen, we would be paying $200 for a toy, and we would be earning 150 grand on average. But what's happened is wages have stagnated, and it's we've been able to get these cheap imports, and we're sort of oppressing the rest of the world to keep our clothing costs low.
That's it.
And it's hidden from us the fact that we've had this runaway asset price bubble, while everything else is just kind of hung around in the doldrums. So you can get a TV for the same price that you could 40 years ago, which is kind of crazy. So the technological unemployment thing, I think that really it's good to be technologically unemployed. We just have to make sure that we share we just have to share it, benefits of that.
And because it ought to be, and increasing our productivity to have a decent income, you don't have to work. You shouldn't have to work 40 hours a week.
I think actually, I think this is a little bit of a stigmatization maybe from people who are not unemployed towards people who are unemployed, because they sort of assume that anyone who's a truck driver who gets put out of work because their trucks can drive themselves, there's nothing else they can do. That's it for that person. But well, what do I do for a living? I help people with software. It's not really a thing. It's not like I'm growing a crop or herding a cow or
You're providing a service.
Providing a service. So the people could do all sorts of stuff.
There's plenty of things
that you could talk or just share your knowledge or teach karate or whatever. Like there's a million things that those people could be doing.
And if the person's willing to pay for it, well, then that's of value. They wouldn't pay for it otherwise.
Right, and if the community is willing to pay for it, then it's a job guarantee job.
It's a job guarantee
and
job.
That's great. So
and if people value that more than say their third flat screen TV in their house,
right.
Then they'll be prepared to pay taxes, not to finance the job guarantee, but to free up the resources. So if that person's doing something and it requires the use of some resources, they don't go into a third flat screen TV, but a person might not really want a third flat screen. They prefer this other service that's not being currently provided.
Yeah, I think that what we're sort of underestimating is that the number of things that could get done by people in our communities if we had the time. So you mentioned that your mum worked at home, providing for the family, like doing all of those services, which now families quite often will pay for. And it's not necessarily as nourishing to have your kids in childcare as it would be to have a group of parents who took care of their kids collectively.
Mm. And by the way, I'm not saying that this would definitely be the case, but it's quite possible that you could have child rearing as a job guarantee.
Well, that happened in the HEFES program
already for child minding and childcare. So does it really matter if it's done in the household by the mother or the father?
Right. That's actually one of the main things that came out of the HEFES program in Argentina, that they were doing community childcare as part of the HEFES program. So I think that's entirely appropriate. And there was the quarterly essay recently from Anne Mann talks about how the feminist movement that rose at the same time as neoliberalism started to really undervalue work done primarily by women that was actually super valuable. It was just really valuable work. So instead of saying, hey, let's recognize the really valuable work done by these women in keeping these households together and all of the child rearing stuff that was predominantly women doing it, instead of saying let's value that, they said let's put women into the same types of work that men are doing in order to find them valuable, which I thought was an interesting take on it. But we could really see a return to those sorts of community programs and pay for it.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting about that, I mean, you could argue that feminists should have perhaps tried to push for more men to do housework and child rearing.
Right.
And if you had a fractional type job guarantee jobs or not even job guarantee jobs, jobs generally, then you might have a situation because a lot of people do like to work. They don't just want to be in the house all the time. You could have both parents working 20, 30 hours a week and
doing some
having
work.
Time, and they share the child rearing.
Yeah, which I do. I mean, because I have a bit of.
If you have a situation where women are predominantly doing the child rearing housework at home, if you try to encourage people to stay at home, well, if that's a problem, that's a cultural problem.
Yeah.
There's no reason why it has to be women. It could be men just as much as women.
Yeah, and I think that's
issue. That's a separate issue altogether.
Men are really missing out on that because I've had the opportunity to do that
because
I run a business, and so I have a fair bit of flexibility. And at various times I've been able to really take a lot of time with my kids, and I enjoy it immensely. And so I think that balance, the work habits that we've gotten into are shifting the balance where instead of saying, hey, everyone should just take more care of their kids and be involved in family, it's like everyone should be working all the time to buy the bigger house or whatever. We might find that once we start freeing ourselves up from using technological unemployment, that we reconnect with a lot of activities which we sort of didn't see as valuable before, like child rearing, like making a really great home, or playing musical instruments, or cooking, or getting really good at
going to an art gallery, or
exercising.
Appreciating art.
We might find that those things start to occupy our time, and that in some ways those turn into work, or that those turn into a definition of work somehow. Yeah, right. Okay, cool. And the job guarantee is really, I think, that is the method by which we transition to that. Because if you say, okay, everyone's going to get unemployed, and then they'll have nothing else to do, so we need to give them a basic income. It denies the fact that there is going to be some purpose beyond the immediate automation horizon. And it just, like, eventually, after 1,000 years, when everything's just perfect and we're living in Star Trek, the job guarantee just kind of becomes a universal basic income once there's nothing else left to do, which I don't know if that'll ever happen.
I think we'll always be doing something. We'll always want to do something.
Right, yeah. I mean,
someone's going to have to press the buttons for the machines. I mean, maybe the machines will be able to press their own buttons. I don't know.
But by the time that happens, I just think it's like 2,000, 3,000 years away. It's just like the unimaginable.
They're still around then.
Right. It's just, I think we've covered off on, is this just work for the dole? Is this just bullshit jobs? No. It's not workfare. It's not work for the dole. It's not bullshit jobs. It's engaging with your community. It's locally proposed.
People maintaining their human capital because if you, like I said, if you are an engineer, you're okay.
So this is interesting because this is another one. We have, if we hire everyone, the private sector will have no bargaining power and they won't be able to hire people. Like they will starve the private sector of jobs, of employees, because everyone will just have too much bargaining power.
No, well, if you've got the option of a $40,000 a year job guarantee job and an $80,000 a year private sector job, which are you going to take if you're willing to work?
Right. So we might starve. The thing is that we've got these businesses that have grown up now that are kind of taking advantage of a negative condition, which is like Uber and Deliveroo and all of these TaskRabbit, which are kind of like a form of slavery. I mean, people are doing work and they're not being paid any benefits. There's no living wage. It's kind of like those companies are taking advantage of the very depressed labour market in order to produce slavery for people that have money. Yeah. So we might starve them of employees, but is that such a bad thing?
Well, that's not a bad thing. I mean, one of the great things about a job guarantee is because you pay people a decent wage, you ensure there are decent conditions of employment. You could make the workplace a fairly democratic one. And what have you, and allow people to be part of the decision-making process, then you'll have a situation where if someone tries to exploit someone in the private sector, they'll say, I just won't accept your job, I'll just take a job guarantee job.
Right. So we will put an end to exploitation.
On conditions as well as wages.
Right, yeah. So the job guarantee defines what exploitation isn't. And anything that goes below that is just like, okay, well, you're exploiting them. You can't...
Yeah, so you don't deserve them anyway.
Right. So you can't say, oh, well, I have the right as a business to exist
don't have the right.
on the back of exploiting people in near slave conditions. That's not a right of business.
Yeah. See, one of the problems we have under the current system, because we don't have a job guarantee, we do have unemployment, is we have a situation where we hear a lot of people say, because we've got unemployment, perhaps businesses should be able to undercut reward wages and conditions because it's better to have people employed than not.
Right.
Well, those people could be employed at decent wage and decent conditions by having them on a job guarantee. Which and if a business can't afford to pay what society considers to be a decent wage and decent conditions of employment, then they don't deserve to be in business making a profit. We don't need those businesses, and it's not as if those people will go unemployed because they'll be on the job guarantee.
Right.
Useful things.
If you and then also another thing that springs to mind is that if everyone's employed and all of a sudden there's all this demand in the economy. Businesses which currently are quite marginal, like a lot of cafes, they struggle to make ends meet. They're being screwed by suppliers, and the rents are going up or whatever. If everyone has more money, that money will actually flow into those businesses as income.
It'd be great for men, particularly because you'd have job guarantee. We're talking about people on fairly low incomes, and people on low incomes have a very high marginal propensity to consume.
Right.
What they spend virtually all of what they receive. And of course that would substantially increase the amount of consumption expenditure, which have a very positive effect on the private sector, and so much so that we might see fewer people in the job guarantee and more people employed in the private sector.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the ideal. In an ideal society, you'd have no one on the job guarantee.
So it's really, I think Bill Mitchell mentioned that it's neighbour. Is that the word? I can't remember.
Neighbour, yeah.
Yeah, that's like
can I say it?
Okay, go.
It's the non-accelerating inflation buffer employment ratio.
Yeah. This is to counteract the Nairu, which is the opposite, right?
Well, the sort of mainstream view of a way of sort of controlling inflation is you have, I won't mention the term, is that you have this pool of unemployed people. Okay, there's this view that there's some trade-off between unemployment and inflation. That when the economy gets too strong, you get inflation, and so to keep inflation steady at some reasonable rate between the Reserve Bank target of 2 to 3%, then you need to have a pool of unemployed people, which I think is an insidious way of controlling inflation.
Yeah, it's quite revolting, really.
So you're using unemployed people as a buffer. Whereas with the job guarantee, you are using people on the job guarantee as the inflation buffer.
Right.
So you have a situation where you have an appropriate ratio of people on the job guarantee to conventional public sector employment, private sector employment, which controls inflation.
Yeah, right. Okay. And then as the spending goes into the economy heats up, everyone hires out of the job guarantee anyway. And that contracts the government spending.
Yeah, that's right. Well, because the amount of spending on the job guarantee depends entirely upon how many people walk through a job guarantee office.
Yeah, right. Okay.
If people getting more, if private sector employment opportunities pick up, and people move out of the job guarantee into the private sector, government spending on the job guarantee falls.
Yeah.
If the private sector, for whatever reason, is employing fewer people and laying people off, then more people walk through the job guarantee office and to get a job guarantee job, and government spending goes up. But that's not going to be inflationary, because the main reason why private sector employment would fall is because there'd be less spending on private sector output, which is going to be due to the fact that the private sector is going to be saving more of its income than it had previously,
which is deflationary,
which is leaving room for the government to run a larger deficit without it being inflationary.
So it's just a machine. The whole thing. It's just and it doesn't need a policy decision. Kevin Rudd doesn't have to make a decision to spend or whatever.
It's an advance on the old Keynesian pump priming of the 50s.
Yeah. This is the new thing.
There used to be an unemployment gap, and then the government would have to think, well, how much do you think we're going to spend in order to bridge that gap? And there's a lot of guesswork involved. And if it's not enough, you still have some unemployment. And if it's too much, you'll have inflation. But with the job guarantee, the government doesn't have to worry about how much it spends. The amount it has to spend to ensure total spending is equal to full employment level of income is determined by the number of people, at the margin, by the number of people who walk into the job guarantee office. And so in the end, the government spends not $1 more than the full employment level and not $1 less.
And so that means that really the notion of requiring fiscal discipline to stop governments from running away and spending and pork barreling is really to say, just define, what does the government spend on? It spends on natural monopolies like roads and infrastructure, NBN,
public goods, public goods. The private sector, it's even mainstream economists will say.
Right, so that's a given.
The private sector doesn't provide public goods in sufficient quantity, so we need governments to do that.
So then beyond that, the government has no discretionary spending, and everything is just either transfer payments or a job guarantee. And it's like, okay, that's it. That's fiscal discipline.
That's it. I mean, I liken the. I don't know if some advocates of the job guarantee would like this description, but I think it's the perfect laissez-faire system.
Right.
Where right at the margin, the amount of spending is in fact going to be determined by the spending and net savings desires of the private sector.
Right.
If people don't like the government spending too much on the job guarantee, then don't save so much and spend.
Invest in something. Put your money, start a cafe. Open a cinema.
The more spending there is, then the less. Well, of course, that means you'll be saving less, but it will mean that the government won't have to spend as much to ensure full employment. So if you don't like the government running big deficits, spend.
Yeah.
That's what it will be.
I like
mean,
it.
if you want to save, then the government will spend more, but that's not going to be a problem. We'll net spend more because by not spending yourself, you're freeing up more real resources, real goods and services for the government to claim without having to tax the private sector in order to minimise or reduce the inflationary effect of its own spending.
Yeah, right. And I think the last point that we had here was the coercion, sort of mutual obligation thing.
Yeah.
Which I get from this sort of Marxist thing. It's kind of like the universal basic income is tied up with this notion that we can't force people to work. I think we kind of covered that when talking about welfare versus the job guarantee, and really I think that it's not coercion. And you know what, like when you really hyper localize this and divorce yourself of the image of this as being like a drab Victory brand 1984 style factory. But it's like I can go down the street and I'm with people in my neighborhood who I know. My kids can come along and play with their kids. We're working. We're making money. That is awesome. Like that's a beautiful vision. And who would go against that? And if you did go against, if you didn't want to get involved, then there's probably you're probably upset. Like you're probably depressed, or there's a mental problem going on, or you really need some help. And that's a different story. But for people to say, oh, like this is we're being coerced into it, it's like, hey man, this is going to be bliss compared to what we have now.
It's bliss. For a lot of people, it would be bliss. But surely, if society is going to provide goods and services to people, and they'll provide them by giving them, if we're talking about a basic income, and of course the job guarantee is just a specific form of basic income, really. So you give them money in order to claim some real goods and services. Surely they have an obligation to help produce those goods and services that they're going to be claiming. So just as much as society has an obligation to provide jobs for people who want to work, it's got to work both ways. You aren't forced to work. You can't be made to work. You're not forced to work. But I think it's and what is also important is that it's healthy for people to do some work. Unemployment leads to a lot of physical and mental health problems.
I think I've seen a presentation where Bill Mitchell talks about the unemployment rate between 15 and 19-year-olds as being like 64%. And that's not because they're at school, that's because they've left school and they're looking for a job. They wanted to get employed. And 64% of them can't find anyone to employ them, obviously because businesses are so marginal, that they can't afford to train and invest in people. And if that's the case, if you have a situation where that's the case, you can't just give those kids money. What are they going to learn? What are they going to be able to do? You've got to give them some work.
There's that. But of course, like I said, if you give people money and they don't produce real goods and services, then the total claims on real goods and services will far exceed the real goods and services available for sale, and it'll be hyperinflationary. People who talk about this basic income as this utopia don't understand the economics involved. It would be hyperinflationary, and it would and it would be disastrous, and it would probably set back any notion of having some sort of universal basic income, even if it was in the form of a job guarantee, for decades.
Right.
It would set it back for decades. People would say, never going to try that again.
So it's actually quite risky.
It is.
And I think that, every discussion I've ever had with the UBI advocate has ended up not being universal anyway. That it's always like, oh, we're going to tax, it's okay because we'll tax these people to fund the program. And it's like, well, okay, if you're doing that, then that's just a means-tested social security payment.
You don't need to tax them, but taxing them, so I guess they're talking about taxing the wealthy, the corporations that aren't. That's a different issue. The government doesn't need those taxes to fund.
Yeah, but I've never found anyone.
But it is an issue. It is an important issue. It just means these people who should be paying a lot more in tax aren't paying that. So in a sense, that's just contributing to the division between rich and poor.
Right. So
that's a distributional issue. That's got nothing to do. It's not a financing issue.
We could tax to solve problems with inequality or productivity or stagnation in certain areas of the economy, something, but it's not a funding thing. But the UBI advocates generally don't have that attitude, the functional finance MMT attitude.
And of course, it's also showing the lack of understanding of modern monetary theory, that they think that in order to fund it, you have to tax people. You don't.
Well, I mean, if you wanted to do it, you could imagine having a universal basic income that wasn't universal, but it was just a basic income, which is just a social security payment, and then you increase taxes to allow you to give money to people at the lower end, which is actually what UBI advocates say. They say it's okay because we'll get it back through the tax system. But that's not universal then. That's just a social security system, which we already have, and I agree we need to improve that, but it doesn't do anything to solve the problem of unemployment.
It doesn't solve it, no, and it doesn't. And of course, a lot of these advocates of basic income say, people they won't work in the standard workforce. They'll produce goods and services for themselves. They'll be gardening and they'll be doing this and then but there's no guarantee that will happen.
Also, that just sounds like a job. It's like they're paying money, they're getting paid money, and they're doing work. So okay,
yeah, they'll have to do some. They'll probably have to do some form of work anyway. Well, simply because, as I said, if you just give people money, and half the population aren't working, then the amount of money that will far exceed the goods and services that are available for sale, and the amount of claims on real wealth will far exceed the amount of real wealth being produced, and it will just be hyperinflation.
So I mean, that's the funny thing. We need to connect the inflation hawks up with the universal basic income. Let them have it out. Once they're finished, we can just introduce the job guarantee. It's like,
like I said, the job guarantee is a special form of basic income.
Yeah.
But the beauty of it is that it leads to price stability as well. So it minimises, it works in such a way that neighbour type of approach, where you get an appropriate ratio of people on the job guarantee working, not unemployed, working, compared to everyone else working, that ensures a stable inflation rate.
Yeah, because you would never have, as the demand increases, production increases. So as the real claims on resources increases, the private sector starts to supply those resources and hires out of the job guarantee. So even if the job guarantee wasn't producing goods for sale,
it doesn't have to be, but yeah, it doesn't have to be producing goods for sale, but it's got to be producing. If it's producing public goods that aren't being sold by the government, then I guess we'd be paying for it in the form of taxation,
because then that would, whatever, if that was required.
That's fine. I mean, that's okay, because we all expect to pay something when we buy something in a shop, a private good. So we should all expect to pay something for a public good.
We forfeit our claim on.
We don't pay for it. So this is the problem with the user paid principle. We don't really need that. We can just use taxes, not as a means of funding it, but the taxes reduce our spending power, which is the cost to us, to free up the resources so the government can provide these things. And they're things that we want. If we don't want them, and that we can vote that government out.
But do it under the model of functional finance, not the model of sound finance. So it's like, in a way, taxes are paying for things because we reduce spending power on one side and allow the government to spend on the other side. But it doesn't have to be one. We are prepared to be taxed in order to, so we don't claim as much as the real stuff that's for sale, so the government can claim it without having to compete with us, and therefore able to claim it without it being inflation. But the main point is that it doesn't have to be equal. Like it's not a dollar for dollar thing. Like they don't tax a dollar and then spend a dollar.
Yeah. And of course, the government doesn't have to sell them back to us. I mean, because governments can run deficits forever.
Yeah. So they might put a price on something in order to augment the way that people use it. But it wouldn't have to be a profitable venture. Like people talk about the white elephant project that doesn't make enough money to fund itself. And it's, well, that doesn't have to.
Well, if it could fund itself, it wouldn't have public goods characteristics and would be provided by
it would be a profit-making venture that would be provided by
So the very nature of public profit from it, but that doesn't mean that it's not beneficial to society.
Yeah, okay. Listen, Phil, I appreciate you giving me I think we've been going for like an hour and a half, and I really appreciate it. I know that you've probably got a lot on. And I just want to thank you for joining us, and it's been incredibly insightful. This is going to answer so many questions of people in the group, and also just give us the ammunition to go out there. We're mansplaining on Twitter, and we just have to...
I'm actually going to be giving a presentation at an anti-poverty SA conference in a couple of months' time, and I think more than anything else out of this, I think that it's really important to start waging a campaign against this notion that governments have to run surpluses, because if we are interested in eliminating unemployment, having full employment, then we need to have governments net spending to the level required to ensure total spending is equal to the full employment level of income. And that's only going to occur if we are able to have a campaign that debunks this idea that governments have to run surpluses or balance the budget.
Have you seen my petition yet? I'll email it to you. I set up a change.org petition to... I don't know, but online petitions are pretty bogus. But I thought maybe if I got enough signatures, it would be at least newsworthy, so I could get it printed.
Yeah, that would be because we need the media talking about this.
It's hard, and I've been trying to talk to journalists, and I'm just a nobody, and there's
really we need an MMT to perhaps get into federal parliament as an independent and just spend 3 years, if it's lower, or in the Senate 6 years, just firing questions at, if it's the lower house, the Treasurer saying, tell me why the government has to balance the budget. Right. and they'll give a ridiculous answer, but then the press gallery will be saying, why does this person keep asking this question? And then it'll become debatable.
Yeah.
So we really need that type of person just asking questions, even if they don't get the correct answer. So no one in the gallery is going to be better informed, but they're going to be thinking, why is this person asking these questions? And then that will perhaps gain more attention.
That's why I started the AEP, because I learned about MMT, and then I was just like, this is intolerable. I can't put up with this anymore. Because I used to listen to ABC radio with the Senate, and as soon as I learned about this stuff, I couldn't listen to it anymore. And then I was watching Scott Ludlam doing Senate estimates one time, and I was like, we need someone doing that. But
even if a party is created where you have candidates running in every seat, okay, and they couldn't care less if they don't get a single vote at an election, but if you had that particular party running candidates in every seat, then that would at least start.
Yeah, it would be something. It would be newsworthy.
It would be newsworthy.
Me and Tim, because Tim's the co-founder of the party, I was talking to him yesterday. I was just saying, what can we do that's newsworthy? We have to be the story. So we're trying to figure that out anyway. If you any ideas that you have.
See, the reason why this doesn't become news from the political point of view is because most people parties are created in order to win seats, to succeed at an election. And of course, the last thing you want to talk about is MMT, even if you might believe in it, because you'll look like a fool and you won't get any votes. We need someone to actually go into an election who couldn't care less how few votes they get, as long as they're talking about this stuff and gets everyone talking about it.
Yeah, well, we've got 102 members.
Right.
We need 398 more members before we can call ourselves a party and be on the ballot and everything. Anyway, thanks very much, Phil. I'll see you later, and we'll stay in touch.
No worries, Ian. Thanks very much for that.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, bye. See ya.